today's webinar, China's Quality and Therapeutic Equivalence Evaluations of Generic Drugs. I'm Grace Wang, BioPharm Regulatory Analyst and Editor. I'll talk about this topic today. First, I'll talk about China's Quality and Therapeutic Equivalence Evaluations of Generics. First, I'll introduce their regulatory requirements. Next, I'll explain how equivalence evaluations impact China's pharma market. And in the third part, I'll share some data on equivalence evaluations to see how the evaluations go. So the equivalence evaluation refers to the evaluation of approved generic drugs according to the principle that they should be equivalent to original drugs in terms of quality and therapeutic efficacy. The quality equivalence mainly relies in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, while the therapeutic efficacy equivalence usually needs to be proved by equivalence study or clinical efficacy trial. These are the different stages of equivalence evaluations of chemical generics. So the equivalence evaluations were first brought up by the State Council in the 12th Five-Year Plan for Drug Safety. The document said that generics without passing quality evaluations shall not apply for license renewal. And later in 2015, the State Council clarified the principle of quality and therapeutic equivalence, but without releasing specific guidelines. It was in 2016 that the former CFDA, which is now National Medical Products Administration, NMPA, the regulatory authority released 3 guidelines on the equivalence evaluations of oral solid dosage forms. And in 2020, NMPA released the technical requirements for chemical injections. So the equivalence evaluations first started from oral solid dosage forms and then expanded to injections. And China is planning to expand the equivalence evaluations to other dosage forms. So which drugs are required to go through equivalence evaluations? According to the State Council, the generics with marketing authorization approved before new classification rules of chemical drugs took effect on March 9th, 2016. So before the new classification rules took effect, the generic drugs were not complying with the equivalence evaluation principle. So they needed to go through the evaluations to prove the equivalency with the original drugs. So these generic drugs include the generic drugs manufactured and marketed in China, the generic drugs manufactured outside China and imported to China, and the drugs manufactured by original international companies in China. This means that the original company has a subsidiary in China, and they produce the drugs in China instead of in their original company. For equivalence evaluations, choosing INND is mandatory. Now, NMPA recommends to choose RLDs from the RLD catalog in the following order of priority. The first choice is the original drug. The original drug could be the one approved in China, which means that it has obtained the China NMPA's marketing authorization. And the original drug can also be drug manufactured by the original foreign pharmaceutical company in China or manufactured with technology transferred from overseas to China. It can also be an original drug not imported to China, but only approved overseas. The next level is the drugs approved in the US, Japan, or the EU. They can also be RLDs. And the third level is other qualified drugs that need to be recognized by China NMPA to be RLDs. There are situations that the applicants cannot find an RLD in the catalog. In this situation, they should apply for RMD listing. One way is the CDE, Center for Drug Evaluation, directly recommends a drug to be RLD, but in this approach, a company is usually not involved. For company applicants, they should submit an application to list the drug as an RLD via the online platform established by CDE. And then CDE will review the documents on the drug. After the review, CDE will organize an expert panel to discuss about the drug. And then CDE will make the discussion result public for 10 work days. If there are no disagreements about the result during the period of publicity, and then NMPA will announce that the drug has become a R&D. As we have known that the equivalence evaluations first started from oral solid dosage forms, the applicants of these drugs need to conduct corresponding researches to prove the in vitro performance equivalence to original drugs. The applicants needed to conduct studies on API, excipients, polymorphic form, particle size, impurity, dissolution. While for in vivo performance, applicants need to conduct BE studies. For drugs without listed RLDs, the applicants needed to conduct clinical efficacy trials. As for chemical injections, their researches include the studies on API, excipient, packaging material, and a container directly contacting the drug. And they also should conduct quality studies, which should include the description, identification, redissolution time, dispersion time, and other data in the quality study report. Also, the stability study is needed. While for in vivo performance equivalence, the applicants needed to study BE study or the applicants need to conduct BE study or clinical trial. But there are some exceptions. These injections are not required to go through equivalence evaluations. For example, sodium chloride injection, glucose injection, glucose and sodium chloride injection, water for injection, and also some radioactive drugs. For example, the drugs containing technetium 99M. Though these drugs do not need to go through equivalence evaluations, they need to go through the quality improvement studies, and their sterilization techniques, filters, and packaging materials should comply with technical requirements. There are also situations that some drugs are permitted to apply for bio-waiver, which is the waiving of BE studies. In 2016, the former CFDA published guidelines on bio-waivers. It says that the BCS 1 and 3 drugs can apply for bio-waivers. And in 2018, NMPA released 2 drugs permitted for biowaivers or simplified BE studies. Now the 2 lists covers 24 drugs that are permitted to be directly exempted from BE studies. Also, 22 drugs are permitted to apply for biowaivers. 13 drugs are permitted to simplified BE studies, and 3 drugs can only go through comparative pharmacokinetic study and safety evaluation. In 2020, China started adopting ICH M9 guideline on biopharmaceuticals classification system based biowaivers, which is a manifestation that the China's guidelines are more aligned with international ones now. After conducting the researches, the applicants should prepare the documents for equivalence evaluation. For oral solid dosage forms, the documents include 4 parts. The first one is the summary. The second, pharmaceutical study, which includes the studies on dosage form and composition, manufacturing, the solution profile, etc. And the third part is the in vitro evaluation, covering the RLD study, the test drugs, the solution profile, and the critical quality attributes, the solution profile comparison, etc. This fourth part is in vivo evaluation, which includes the finished drugs clinical trial, fed and unfed BE studies. As for injection, the documents also include 4 parts. The first is also the summary, and the second is the pharmaceutical study, which covers the dosage form, composition, product development, manufacturing, API and excipient controls, finished drug quality control, reference drug, and stability studies. And the third part is non-clinical study, which usually covers the allergy, hemolysis, local irritancy, and other safety tests. While the fourth part is clinical trial. It includes the fed and unfed BE studies, method validation, biological sample analysis. Now let's look at the procedures and the timeline for equivalence evaluation application. After the applicant conducts the corresponding studies and submits the equivalence evaluation application, the NMPA will conduct a format review within 5 days. If the application's data is authentic and complete, then NMPA will establish case files for the application within 45 work days. After that, the CFDI, the Center for Food and Drug Inspections, will conduct on-site inspection within 60 work days. If sample testings are needed, the local institutes for drug control will conduct the testing. After that, the Center for Drug Evaluation, CDE, will conduct the technical review on the equivalence application. And after that, if CDE finds data deficiency in the application, the applicant will need to submit supplemental documents within 4 calendar months. And after that, if the data is sufficient, NMPA will grant equivalence approval. There are also drugs deemed to pass the equivalence evaluations, which means that the drugs didn't go through the exact equivalence evaluation procedures, but achieve equivalence. The first category is that the drugs manufactured in China and approved by NMPA under the new classification system, which took in effect on March 9th, 2016. Because the new classification, under the new classification system, the marketing authorization applications all apply with the quality and the therapeutic equivalence principle. So if the drug obtains marketing authorization after that, after the new classification system took effect, the drug has achieved the equivalence. The third to fourth category of drugs are all generics approved in the EU, the US, or Japan. Specifically, the second category are drugs marketed in China and manufactured on the same production line with same manufacturing techniques in China. For these kind of drugs, the applicant should submit technical documents on overseas BE study and pharmaceuticals research. After NMPA approves the documents, the drug will be deemed to pass equivalence evaluation. The third category is that the drugs approved in the EU, the US, or Japan, they are marketed in China, but they are manufactured on a different production line or with a different manufacturing techniques in China. For these drugs, the applicant should submit application for change, which should cover the overseas manufacturing process, BE study, and pharmaceutical research. After NMPA approves the application for changing the manufacturing process, the drug will be deemed to pass the equivalence evaluation. While the fourth category is the generic drugs approved in the US, in the EU, the US, or Japan, but not marketed in China. So these drugs need to apply for marketing, needs to submit marketing authorization to China NMPA. If there are two situations. If the drugs has no ethnical differences according to the clinical research, the applicant can submit marketing authorization application covering overseas BE study and pharmaceutical research. But if there are ethnic differences, the applicant should conduct clinical trial and then submit MA application to NMPA. After NMPA approves the MA application, the drug will be deemed to pass the equivalence evaluation. For drugs with approved equivalence or deemed to pass the equivalence evaluation, their applicants can print the logo of passing the generic drug equivalence evaluation on the drug packages, so that the customers will know that these drugs are equivalent to original drugs. Now we come to the next part, how equivalence evaluations impact China's pharma market. So the general trend is that generics with approved equivalence, they are expected to take higher market shares. So here is an estimation on China pharma market shares before and after equivalence evaluations. So after the equivalence evaluation, the off-patent original drugs market share in China drops from 50% to 20%, while the generics with approved equivalence, their market share rises from 38% to 60%, and innovative new drugs also experiences a growth in market share. I think there are three reasons. The first reason is that the generics improve their quality and therapeutic efficacy so that they can compete with the original drugs. Because of the two regulations, because China stipulates that under the same non-proprietary name, if one generic drug has been approved for the equivalence evaluation, the other generic drugs are required to be approved within 3 years. Otherwise, the other generics are not permitted to apply for license renewal. So for these generic drugs that are not immediate, whose applicant did not apply for equivalence evaluation immediately, they are likely to be to lose the license renewal opportunity. The second regulation is that under the same non-proprietary name, if there are 3 generics passing the equivalence evaluations, other generics without passing the evaluations are not permitted to bid for volume-based procurement of drugs, which are used in public healthcare institutions. So these drugs without passing the equivalence evaluations, they lose the market opportunity, especially in the public hospitals. So for generic drugs, they have 2 ways. One is to strive to be equivalent to original drugs so that they can compete with original drugs and other generics. While for generics that stays at a low level in quality and therapeutic efficacy, they will gradually lose the competitiveness on the market. The second reason is that the generics usually have lower prices than original drugs, so they have price advantages in volume-based procurement. Volume-based procurement is China government's program for procuring drugs to be used in public hospitals. It was first implemented in 4 and 7 cities. That was a pilot program in 2018. But in the next year, China decided to expand the program to the national level. So by far, China has carried out 7 rounds of national VBPs. To get a place in the volume-based procurement, the companies need to bid for it. And their drugs are required to be original drugs, reference listed drugs, or generics with approved or proved equivalence. So in the bidding, the drugs with the lowest prices will win, and the companies have to ensure sufficient and steady supply as agreed in the contract with the drug procurement office. Here is an example of bidding results of ambrisentan tablets in the second national VBP. There were 4 companies, Huahai Pharmaceutical, Hansen Pharma, China Tianqing. All 3 are Chinese pharmaceutical companies. And another international company, GSK, which bid for the place of VBP place. But there were only 2 companies, Huahai Pharmaceutical and Hansen Pharma, won the bidding because they slashes their prices at the highest level, while China Tianqing and the GSK, so they lowered their prices but their unit prices are still higher than the other two. So the drugs with the lowest prices won the bid. So that's why the generics with relatively lower prices win in the VBP program. And the third reason is that substituting off-patent drugs with generics lessens the pressure on National Social Health Fund. Generics with improved equivalence and relatively low prices are likely to get into National Reimbursement Drug List, which is a list of drugs covered by National Social Health Care Insurance. This list is adjusted by China almost every year. China delists the drugs with low clinical value and adds the drugs with high clinical value. Also, the diagnosis-related payment pushes hospitals to give prescriptions reasonably, reducing the medical expenses on unnecessary prescriptions. So in the past, the pharmaceutical representatives can give commission money to the doctors which prescribe their drugs, but now the drugs used in public hospitals are covered by the VBP program. So such a relationship between the pharmaceutical representatives and the hospitals no longer existed. Thus, the hospitals need to prescribe drugs more reasonably. So the National Social Health Fund won't need to reimburse too much money on expensive drugs. Here is an example of 4 drugs which passed the equivalence evaluations in 2016. According to the China Health Insurance magazine, if patients use the generic versions of these 4 drugs, their reimbursement amount will drop remarkably. Now I'll share some data on equivalence evaluations. So from 2016 to today, there are already 4,218 equivalence evaluation applications accepted by NMPA, among which 2,560 applications are already approved. And generics applying for equivalence evaluations reached 7,742, and they are applied by 552 companies. Also, the ANDAs under the new classification system, which are reviewed according to the equivalence principle, their number achieved 7,713, among which the 2,312 are already approved. Among the equivalence evaluation applications, almost 1/3 are for tablets, and 1/4 are for powder for injection, and about 23% are for injections, about 10% are for capsules, and the left are for other dosage forms. Here are the top 10 generics with approved equivalence. So we can see that the top 10 generics are mostly for cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, diabetes, gastrointestinal disease, or they are antiviral drugs or analgesics. So these are the most popular generics with approved equivalence. Here are the top 10 companies which have the highest numbers of generics with approved equivalence. The first is Qilu Pharmaceutical, and the second is CSPC Pharmaceutical. Third is China Tianqin. All the top 10 companies are Chinese generic companies. So we can see that the Chinese generic manufacturers are trying to seize their opportunities to compete with original drugs. So this is what I want to talk about the equivalence evaluations. And I have received some questions about this topic. The first is that does China have preferential policies for the drugs with approved equivalence? The answer is yes. China will give appropriate support to generics with approved equivalence in terms of medical insurance payment, and the authority encourages in healthcare institutions to prioritize using the generics in clinical settings. And also manufacturers of generics with approved equivalence can apply for financial support from the central government. The second question is how to buy the RLD. Usually the RLD is bought by the company from overseas directly, and the RLD's packaging insert and the receipt should be included in the equivalence evaluation application, so that the NMPA can confirm that the RLD belongs to the corresponding manufacturer. The third question is that can test drugs from different production batches be used in the same BE study? The general rule is that these drugs should be coming from the same production batches. Thank you all for attending our webinar.